Okay. Attendees are filling up. We've got 2 more minutes before we start, or yeah, 2 more minutes. I'm going to start right at 11 o'clock. Hello, everyone. My name is Darren Michaels, and I am the host of this new hour-long semi-regular webinar series from Scott Laboratories, where we discuss interesting topics, try and answer questions related to wine, cider, or specialty beverage production. From yeast and nutrients to stabilization and filtration, we dip into the Scott Labs vault of over 80 years of experience to bring you the latest in research and technical applications. We hope these webinars will spark the flame of conversations and bring together the old and the new, the classic and the innovative. I am Darren Michaels. I'm your host during this journey. I'm a Scott Labs fermentation outside technical expert, a very wordy title. I just prefer Darren. Originally from California, now up here in the Pacific Northwest in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge. And despite being halfway through June, we still have rain. We had some rain like yesterday. So it's kind of nice to see the rain and then be followed up by sun. But now at this point, I'm just hoping my tomato plants will throw some fruit someday in the future. I'm hoping, at least at some point, but I don't know. Who knows? I want to thank you all for attending and can't stress enough how thankful I am that you took time out of your day to join us. First, some quick webinar tips. If you're not used to this, make sure you can see the audio settings on the lower left. Along the bottom, there's the chat, the raise hand, and the Q&A buttons, which will be the main channels for communication. You can change your audio settings or test your microphone, although that's maybe not necessary if you don't want to do that. In the up arrow menu next to the microphone icon, if you're having any issues, and please don't forget to use the raise hand button if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally during the question and answer period. We'll have a question and answer period after this. Today, I'd like to introduce to you, if you're not already familiar with him, is a great presenter with a great topic, our friend Luke Holcombe, and the basics of oxygen management to preserve wine quality. Luke started the wine industry about 15 years ago, has worked at large facilities like McManus Family Vineyards in Cali, and then head winemaker for Post Winery in Arkansas, and then with a lot of smaller clients and even some micro scale winemaking. Who doesn't love to ferment 5 gallons of wine? Most recently, he's been giving technical presentations as our Scott Labs regional sales team representative for the Midwest, and today he's reporting from beautiful Oklahoma. I consider this webinar a first in a series about oxygen and winemaking because honestly, oxygen is hard. We need it to live, but wine is not a simple beverage and it's hard sometimes to control oxygen exposure. Sometimes you want a lot of oxygen, sometimes you don't want any, and oxygen is everywhere. So this is a back to basics primer about oxygen, its effects and how to manage it. This is a webinar where I would consider it to be, as we move further in our journey through the relationship with oxygen and winemaking or beverage making. This will be the first, and I'll probably refer back to this one several times because we're going through some stuff. Our last webinar was for anyone who wanted to know the why and how of spoilage control, and if you haven't checked it out, please do. But this one is for anyone interested in the why and how of oxygen control, or more importantly, avoiding the possible damage of uncontrolled oxygen introduction. In later webinars, like I said, we'll go into more depth about oxygen and its role in fermentation, anthocyan and stabilization, redox concepts. At the end of this webinar, I hope you come away with an understanding what uncontrolled oxygen exposure can do to your final product and some common concepts of oxygen mitigation and industry terminology. We'll start with the type of damage oxygen can cause, factors that can directly or indirectly increase or decrease your oxidative risk, and provide an overview of what oxygen management looks like. We'll discuss some common industry terms and finish on the importance of understanding oxygen uptake during bottling. During the talk, I'll be posting several quick polls. Please feel free to fill them out. And after the talk, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So some people have submitted questions to us. We'll try and hit them up at the end. As usual, if you have any questions that occurred during the talk, feel free to post them on the questions on the Q&A section. Press that Q&A button, and we'll try and answer them after the presentation. But your questions will be anonymous. And during chatting, I should mention, you can only chat to the panelists, and we can only chat back to you. So you can't really chat with each other, but that's okay. As I said before, we also keeping an eye on the attendees window, looking for raised hands if you'd like to verbally ask your question. And then very quick, a follow-up is a survey afterwards. That's your next to do. Please fill that out, and that has space for ideas for future topics that you'd like to hear about. We heard a lot of ideas in the last webinar, but please don't hesitate to throw some more ideas out there. And redundancy is absolutely perfect, because if it seems like there's a topic that keeps coming up and coming up and coming up, we'll push that to a priority status and we'll move forward with that. It's just, you know, we're recording this webinar, so it's being recorded right now. We're making it available soon after today. Assuming everything goes well, I won't have to edit it. Last one, I didn't edit at all. This one, who knows? But I might have to edit it, so it'll delay it. Typically, eventually we'll have it on the website. It'll be really easy to find. Google it, whatever. For now, though, we're putting the link in the next introduction of the webinar. But don't hesitate to email me if you need it. I've said this before, and it's a theme that I've done for a number of years now. Sometimes in winemaking, it feels like you're herding cats. And so without further ado, let's start herding some cats. I'd like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Luke Holcombe, our resident oxygen obsessive. Take it away, Luke.
Well, thank you, Darren, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. This may not be the most interesting topic that really gets our nerd juices flowing, but I promise if you do have a little bit of nerd inside of you, it will be awakened by this presentation, hopefully. You know, globally, oxygen and oxidative related issues, one of the most prevalent problems in the industry, and I was lucky, I guess, in a way, to experience this early on in my career, where I saw the deleterious effects of oxygen on a fairly delicate wine, and it really related to packaging, and that kind of set me down this rabbit hole. And since then, I've, you know, over the years, have started to make up my own ways of doing things, and implemented and trialed and experimented, and you know, taken pieces from literature over here and anecdotal information over there, and really put it together. And then since working for Scott Labs for about the last 5 years, I've been on a mission to spread this dogma or obsessiveness to other people. And you know, I've had a lot of feedback from customers that have said, okay, you know, I believe you. I think this is important. I'm going to start doing this. And really, these customers come away with, after a year or so of looking back, hindsight being 20/20, and that has a significant impact on wine quality in the right way. And this, I think, dovetails really nicely with Nicola's presentation, because, you know, she really focused on microbial control agents, spent some time on sulfur dioxide. And, you know, the third part of that, the third leg of that stool, you have microbial control agents, SO2, oxygen has to be part there as well, because we'll get into why, but if you don't have control of your oxygen, a lot of times that basically means you don't have control of your SO2, and you don't have control of your microorganisms. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We'll get into it. A little bit about me. I was raised in California, went to school at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I have my degree in winemaking. I was a TA and studied under Bruce Socklin. He's a big influence on this, and we'll have something about him in the presentation. Made wine a little bit on the Central Coast, in the Central Valley, and then sojourned out to Arkansas. And a lot of people don't know about winemaking in the Midwest, but I went to work at Post Winery. Was there for about 6 years. Pretty good sized winery, about 160,000 cases or so. And, you know, really the products that we were producing there were really high risk insofar as the chemistry and how we're packaging. And so really had to be on the ball. And with most of my experience in the wines I've produced going straight into distribution, the margin for error is very, very small. So that's kind of my background. I appreciate everyone tuning in. I will do my best to not say a lot, because I think that is a webinar faux pas that a lot of presenters make. So I'm going to try not to do that. Please feel free to reach out for me after this, and we can dive down some more rabbit holes. But this is an overview and a fundamentally some of the foundational concepts and terminology that we need to have so we can build upon this in the future. Oop, a little too fast. Okay, so here's the goals of the webinar, because I like to look at what we're going to do, and then we're going to do it, and then we're going to revisit and say what we did. So this presentation is, for one, trying to explain why a winemaker should be concerned with oxygen and oxygen management, provide an overview of what this management looks like, and then describe how and when to measure dissolved oxygen. We're also going to discuss how to assess an oxidation risk, like which wines maybe are more sensitive to things than other ones. And I think the concept of risk mitigation or risk assessment is one of these foundational principles that we can apply not only to oxygen, but microbial stability and how we prioritize things in the cellar and what we pump first and what we pump later and how we deal with things. It's important to have a good understanding of risk assessment. And this can kind of dovetail in the future into things like HACCP plans. Because when you're doing hazard analysis, critical control point, you're identifying the spots in the process that have a greater risk than others. So I'm going to give you some tools to do that here. We'll also briefly discuss mitigation techniques. So in building from this and in future presentations, we're going to go farther down in the rabbit's hole on some of this stuff. So if you have a very specific question, we're probably not going to cover all of it in this presentation, but we will eventually. And if you have some specific questions, you can follow up with Darren or I. We're also going to establish some baseline terminology and discuss fundamentals. People that know me, one of the stereotypes that I go back to again and again is words have meaning. And especially in a highly technical industry like we're in, we have to know what these words are, what they mean, and how to apply them. And if we don't have that, then a lot of times we can get ourselves down a trail and it can be the wrong trail. So this is kind of the difference between being effective and being efficient. I would much rather be effective than efficiently looking at something over here. We're also going to politely address some of the sacred cows. And this is correlated to this baseline terminology and fundamentals. So, I mentioned that oxygen-related wine faults really spread the breadth of faults and flaws in the industry, and they're extraordinarily prevalent. This picture here is, obviously they're doing this on purpose. This is for sherry production, and you can see the mycoderma candida formation right there on the top of the wine. And this is a display barrel, but it shows the terminal end of oxidation, but a controlled oxidation. Cherry production is still controlled. It's not uncontrolled process. So the wine faults and flaws that are correlated with oxygen include all of the ones up on the screen: browning, pinking, acetobacter growth, candida growth and the mycoderma formation, acetaldehyde production, premature aging, short shelf life. Now, a lot of times when I've given this presentation or something similar to this in various seminars, I kind of ask for a show of hands. Like, how many people have had a wine in the bottling tank that was just beautiful, is exactly what you wanted, and you bottled it, and like 6 months later is gone. It was just not what you intended. And that's really speaking to bottle shock, which we're somewhat familiar with, but there's more to it than that. Bottle shock is not something that we don't have control over. We have very precise control over bottle shock should we want to. Mousiness is becoming a big topic right now, especially with the natural wine movement. It's very prevalent also in high pH areas, especially if you're barrel aging. This tends to occur more and more frequently. At least it has in my experience in the last few years. I've seen it a lot more. And it's really, you have to have oxygen in the system in order for mousiness to happen, very generally speaking. Also VA production, volatile acidity. This is directly correlated with free bioavailable oxygen. Also volatile sulfur compound expression. And what I mean by this is commonly referred to as reductive characters or reduction. And what we're going to try to do today is paint the picture that reduction is not a smell. It is the process, and redox potential and reduction is the mechanism, the electrochemical mechanism that these volatile sulfur compounds express themselves. And that's kind of a whole rabbit hole on its own, and we're going to give it an overview, but I think we need to have a good fundamental understanding of what we're talking about. Depletion of free SO2. It's a huge thing. You know, sulfur dioxide is one of our best broad spectrum antimicrobial tools that we have, but it's also an antioxidant. And if we don't have control of our oxygen, then it's going to primarily be used as an antioxidant, and there's very little left over to work as an antimicrobial. So that's why there's the three legs to the stool, that you have microbial control, SO2, and oxygen. So this is focusing on having a better understanding and a better control mechanism for microbial control. There's also a term here called barrel shock that I kind of want to introduce. We're comfortable with bottle shock, but I do think that there is such a thing called barrel shock, and we'll get into why. I was going to put a trademark on that, or registered or something next to that copyright, but I'm just throwing that out there. It's my own term. Also, loss of fruitiness and freshness. This is kind of correlated to that premature aging and short shelf life, and it's just really a loss in freshness, and the wine degrades too quickly in the bottle. Color degradation, again, this can be browning or pinking, or that brackish color that eventually happens. Unwanted Brett character. So for example, Brett produces a lot more volatile acidity in the presence of free bioavailable oxygen than it does otherwise. So when you're looking at mitigation strategies for Brett, this is something you want to keep in mind. And then of course, oxidized aromas, which is that acetaldehyde, the classic sherry aromas. So, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in 2020 that we're still talking about oxygen, and it's still something that I think as an industry worldwide, we don't have a really good grasp on. And some of this has been through experience, and it's also just the global market that has developed over the past few decades. So we understand that, oxygen plays into microbial degradation. And so in the process of trying to control microorganisms, we're doing maybe a lot more filtration, things like that. And maybe that's exacerbating our dissolved oxygen problem. Tartrate stability, we'll get into why that is really a fundamental area where I think the oxidation risk is really, really high. And it has to do with physics. That's not opinion, and we'll get into that. Protein stability. Again, we're trying to find these proteins out potentially, or prevent the formation, or maybe bind them up on the juice stage or during fermentation. But it's just more processing, and we're also in the pursuit of clarity. So one of the things I think, like maybe the beer and cider industry has done a really good job of, is getting consumer acceptance of haziness, right? So hazy IPA is a total category in of itself. I don't know that hazy Pinot Noir is. And this is since we've gone down this road, we've kind of conditioned the customer and the consumer to expect 100% clarity. And because of that, we have to, rack more often. We have to filter, and we have to chill and clarify, and so on and so forth. This is more processing. This is more dissolved oxygen pickup. Also, consumer demand. I think, again, we've trained our customers to expect this brilliantly clear tartrate protein and microbially stable product. And then, if you combine kind of shelf stability in with distribution and shipping, as we're shipping wine all over the world now, we can't have wine just re-ferment or go bad in the bottle in short amounts of time. So in order to do that, we've this push for shelf stability. Again, we're processing a little bit more, and this is we're maybe shooting ourselves in the foot to a certain extent. And then also hang times, higher pHs, different winemaking conditions. Really what I'm trying to focus on there is like what you can do in a cold climate with low pHs. If you take that winemaking philosophy and apply it to a high pH winemaking environment, you're probably going to experience a lot more issues just as a whole. So historical approaches to oxygen management. So there are certain cellar-based mitigation strategies. I think this is where we get this concept of gravity flow facilities. And this is related to pumping. And we think that pumping is negatively affecting our wine. And sometimes, yes, certain pumps have different attributes, and maybe you're using the wrong pump for the job. But also you can a lot of times pick up a lot of oxygen through pumping. And so people have tried to get away from that, and they're using gravity flow in an effort to have higher quality wine. But really what I think the fundamental here is dissolved oxygen pickup. Inert pressing, this is something I think we'll cover later, but this seems to be something of a revolving door every 20 years or so. It's like the press manufacturers start coming out with inert pressing and saying that this is the greatest thing in the industry. But whether it is or is not is a topic for another time. But this is one of the strategies people are using to reduce oxidation. Reductive winemaking, this is really a hot buzzword right now. I think reductive winemaking is an okay term to use, but being reductive on the front end versus being reductive on the back end, and how that globally looks throughout the winemaking process, it needs to be defined a little bit more. Again, unfiltered styles of wine, people, I've heard lots of winemakers say, oh, I don't like to filter because it destroys the wine. Well, there's plenty of research that suggests otherwise. I think what I'm going to try to point out is that filtering and pumping and cellar actions, it's really the dissolved oxygen that you pick up and are not addressing that's causing these problems more than a 0.45 plate and frame filter or some specific media or some porosity or micron rating of a specific media. And people of course, are using inert gases in a lot of ways. Typically, it's in headspace management, but I'm gonna suggest that headspace management is kind of a smaller part of the picture than we think it is. Also headspace minimization. Making sure things are topped up. That's kind of, everybody knows that. We'll talk a little bit more about that, because one area that I think that we don't pay attention to headspace minimization as much as we should is on the bottling line. Barrel topping schedules. So this is correlated to that concept of barrel shock. Everybody can kind of probably picture in their mind right now the sound that occurs when you pull a bung off of a barrel. And it's like kind of that whooshing sound, and it's air going into the barrel. And one of the things I like to bring up is how much oxygen or air is in a vacuum. And what is that sound doing? That is air rushing in. And then you're topping with wine that is probably not low dissolved oxygen, because it's probably coming from a small container. And so it has a really high surface area. So we'll cover a little bit more about that later. Blending. So this is a common thing where you have a wine that maybe has seen too much oxygen, and the color's starting to degrade, you're getting a little bit of that aldehydic nose. And so you bring in a wine that has bigger aromatics and a bigger tannin structure to try to balance some of that out. We spend a lot of time on cap management and fixing of phenolics. And we can go down the rabbit's hole on pump overs and pneumatage and delistage and rack and returns and all the different strategies. But a lot of times is you're trying to capture the phenolics and stabilize them while you have the chance to when you're on the skins, because you can add exogenous tannins down the road, but a lot of people want to try to maximize, because you've paid so much money for that fruit, you want to try to maximize your capture of those endogenous or indigenous phenolics. And then surly aging. I think a lot of people understand that there are some protective benefits to surly aging, and you can do that. It's kind of process heavy. It's also you got to make sure that the lees is very healthy. Otherwise, you can be releasing a lot of these negative sensory compounds. And Lallemand has come out with quite a few different products that are somewhat of an alternative to early aging. So it gives you the benefits without a lot of the risks that are associated with the negative sensory compounds. And I like to zoom out a little bit and talk about packaging. When you're trying to bottle a wine for very long-term aging, what's commonly done is you have a really large format bottle and you use a really large, high quality, very dense cork. And those are two things to think about when you're looking at the rest of oxygen management. So you have large format and you have a really dense cork. And there's a reason for those two things, and we'll talk about those in the future. There's also, you can help adjust oxygen management. You can help adjust the buffering capacity by the use of enological additives. Everyone knows generally about SO2, tannin addition. So improving the structure or making that structure larger so that it can increase its buffering capacity of oxygen. Oak adjuncts, so again, increasing your buffer capacity and helping fix those phenolics. And you could do that at the juice stage. Potentially you could even do it in the picking bin. During fermentation, there's a lot of different ways that we do this also in aging. We also use enzymes, exogenous enzymes, to improve extraction. Again, trying to maximize our time on the skins in order to pull the things out that we want to. Oak aging, again, this is similar to the oak adjuncts. This is adding polyphenolics to the wine to increase the buffer capacity. And I say oak aging because I'm including not just barrels, but oak adjuncts in the form of staves, rods, cubes, beans, chips, all those things, as well as purified oak extracts in the form of tannins. Also, we use fining agents to reduce metals, and then also sometimes as a remedial step to improve the aromatics or remove some of the color compounds that we consider negative after the wine has been overly oxidized. Also, tartrate inhibitors. This is in an effort to reduce the step of chilling for cold stability, for tartrate stability. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a couple slides. Also, ketosan and velcorin. These are new microbial control agents, or I should say newer, that we can use to increase the effectiveness of sulfur dioxide as an antioxidant, or allow you to use less sulfur dioxide for microbial control because you have more tools in your toolbox. Darren, do you see a hand raised? Was there something you want to address there real quick? There's a couple hands raised, but let's keep.
Yeah, let's keep going because you've got a number of slides and it's 11:28. So
okay, here we go. So factors that directly or indirectly increase oxidative risk. This is again risk assessment. So these are going to increase your oxidative risk. High pH, low SO2 usage, whether that is accidental or this is a philosophical approach to wanting to use less SO2. Barrel aged as well, I think this is where we see a significant amount of spoilage in the wine industry is during barrel aging. So this in general, in my opinion, increases oxidative risk. Traditional cold stability, we'll talk about why that is, has to do with gas solubility based on temperature and pressure. And then another way to assess things is what sort of polyphenolic content does your wine have? And what I'm saying is, like, here on the delicate side, you have Pinot Grigio, as opposed to maybe on the higher phenolic side, something like Tannat. Those two are not going to behave the same. And so the lower the polyphenolic content, the lower the antioxidant capacity, and therefore the riskier it is. Small batch sizes, and this is just a function of physics. How much volume you have of wine and its relative surface area to oxygen exposure. Small package formats. So again, 187 ml cans, you have to approach this completely differently than you would like a 750 ml bottle. When you look at taking a 750 and putting in a 375 ml can, you have half the volume that you're dealing with now. And so every action, generally speaking, is going to have some fixed amount of oxygen that you're going to come in contact with. So when this is that concept of the solution to pollution is dilution. So 750 mils, you have more to dilute that pollution of oxygen in, as opposed to 187 mils, for example. Same thing goes for the batch size. Splash racking post-fermentation increases your oxidative risk. That should be pretty obvious. High metal content, so copper and iron, that drastically increases your risk. Fruit degradation, so dealing with fruit that maybe has some damage to it, whether that be physical damage or microbial damage through rot. And very generally, hand picking. This should actually be on the other slide. Sorry about that. So hand picking is actually should decrease your oxidative risk because you have a higher quality fruit, and mechanically harvesting should be on this slide to increase oxidative risk. That being said, I've seen hand-picked fruit that was really in rough shape, and I've seen mechanically harvested fruit that was beautiful. So these it depends, right? So to decrease your oxidative risk, the lower pH products, 3.6 is kind of my tipping point there. pH appropriate SO2 content. So if you were maintaining a 0.5 to 0.8 molecular SO2, I think you're helping yourself a lot. But again, this is important to have control of your oxygen while you have appropriate SO2 content. Using oak adjuncts, again, increasing buffer capacity, decreases your oxidative risk. Using tartrate inhibitors as opposed to traditional cold stability decreases your oxidative risk. Having high polyphenolic content, aka like a Tannat or Petit Syrah, things like that, they're going to be more, they're going to have the higher buffering capacity compared to something like Pinot Grigio or Pinot Noir. Large batch sizes, again, solution to pollution is dilution. So you're going to have a bigger body to dilute that oxygen pickup in. Again, larger package formats like a Melchior, Nebuchadnezzar, Methuselah bottles. This is what we have done historically in the past for longer aging cycles. Proper volatile sulfur compound prevention and remediation is important. That helps you decrease your oxidative risk. And that is somewhat correlated with low metal content. So this is why we don't recommend using we recommend getting away from ferrous metals like iron rakes, for example, for pulling the grapes out, and sticking with things that are stainless, plastic, stuff like that, that don't have the extractable metals. Decrease your oxidative risk, high quality fruit. That should go without saying. So real quick, there's a few slides here. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this. This is just for some definitions that, that I use when I talk to customers about oxidation. So dissolved oxygen is the measurement of concentration of DO in the wine, expressed commonly in parts per million or milligrams per liter. Total package oxygen, this is a very important concept. Total package oxygen is your bottle headspace, your bottling line oxygen pickup, so from the hose to the pump to the filler, through the valve, in the bottle, all that, plus your dissolved oxygen of your wine. That's very important. Consumptive rate. So in my opinion, this is where oxygen is added, either accidentally or intentionally, aka micro-ox, and the totality of the oxygen is consumed in polymerization reactions. There's no increase in dissolved oxygen, no increase in volatile acidity, and no depletion of free SO2. So it's being completely consumed in these polymerization reactions and is not negatively affecting some of these other parameters. Total oxygen uptake capacity. Again, use this to refer back to in the future when we start building upon these concepts. The capacity of a wine over time to, without deleterious effect, absorb exposure to oxygen. And how many saturations can a wine endure? So to tie this back to another concept we talked about, Pinot Grigio is going to have a lower total oxygen uptake capacity compared to something like Tannat. Okay, so this is why you have to be deliberate in your winemaking. Redox potential measured in millivolts. This is a snapshot representing whether the wine is reduced or oxidized and what state it's in. Here's kind of a general parameters on those readings and what they correlate to. So we can use that in the future to refer back to. Metal content. Iron is an oxidative catalyst with medium strength. Copper is a much stronger oxidative catalyst. Volatile sulfur compound, VSC. I'm going to use that VSC as a abbreviation. Reduction, I have a question mark there. This is not a smell, it's a symptom, not the cause, okay? So reduction is related to the redox potential, and the smell is correlated to your volatile sulfur compound chemistry and the concentration of the various compounds and the form that they are taking at any given time, which is affected by your redox potential. OTR, oxygen transmission rate. This is typically referring to a closure. And I'll throw this out there that we spend a lot of time in the industry on OTR and not enough time looking at dissolved oxygen. So if you're not measuring your dissolved oxygen, but yet you're very concerned about which closure has what OTR, I think you're seeing the forest for the trees. That's kind of one way to look at that. So measurement of dissolved oxygen, when do you do it? Personally, I start being very concerned right after primary fermentation. Malolactic bacteria do not require dissolved oxygen, but all the other bad guys that at that time in the wine's life where there's very little dissolved oxygen, very little sulfur dioxide as a preservative, you still have active carbon sources in there like malic acid, and you probably have a pretty high microbial load. This is when you want to start looking at maybe controlling your dissolved oxygen, because it's there bioavailable for some of the deleterious actors, like acetobacter and things like that. I believe anytime you do a cellar treatment, so racking, fining, filtration, temperature change, blending, all these different things, I think you should measure your dissolved oxygen and then decide whether or not you need to take mitigation steps. Generally speaking, the closer you get to bottling, the more careful you have to be with oxygen, and you should be measuring. You're closer to that 100-yard line in the end zone, and so it becomes more and more important. During bottling, I think you need to be watching dissolved oxygen on an hourly basis, just like you would fill heights and your torques on your screw caps, or your monitoring whether or not your corker is pulling a correct vacuum, which is bottle shock, which is dissolved oxygen. That's why we have vacuum corkers. And how? Well, with a meter. There's a picture of a meter on the right-hand side. So one of these concepts that I think we need to really understand is this surface area per gallon idea. So in a tank, you're going to have a lower exposure per gallon to oxygen compared to if you break that 6,000 gallon tank down into 160 gallon barrels and then take those barrels and then break them down into bottles. As you start decreasing container size, your exposure increases significantly. And this is why when you're looking at new packages and you've gone from a 750 ml bottle to a 375 ml or 187 or a 250 ml can, you really have to focus on this much, much more, because your exposure at that point not only is higher than it's ever been in the wine's life, it's also the last chance you have to do it right. So another good concept, and I think most people know this already. If you have a 2-liter bottle of soda that you've poured a couple glasses out, and you want to maintain the carbon dioxide in there and make sure it doesn't go flat, what do? You put it in the fridge. You don't leave it out on the counter. So the fundamental concept is the relationship of temperature and solubility. The colder a liquid is, the higher amount of gas solubility you have. There's also a function of pressure there as well, atmospheric to a certain extent, but also if you're doing any sort of carbonation, which whole other topic. But generally speaking, as your temperature goes up, your gas solubility goes down. Now, if we're looking at 0 degrees Celsius, and we commonly do cold stability at or below this temperature, you can look at how many ppm of oxygen can be dissolved. And this is functionally why there's a strong case for tartrate inhibitors, tartrate crystal formation inhibitors. And also for an oxygen scavenger, you know, if you are doing traditional cold stability, maybe something like Pure Lee's Longevity can be in there to help mitigate the consumption of dissolved oxygen. So again, a little bit more terminology. When you're talking about gases, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around. Saturation is one of them. Saturation to me is when you have 500 gallons of wine, you have 500 gallons of gas dissolved in that. Maybe more specifically, that's a volume, but for this case, that's what I'm going to define saturation. Solubility refers to solubility of specific gas at a specific pressure and temperature. Generally, gases are inversely soluble with temperature and directly soluble with pressure. Inert gases and their respective behavior in winemaking. So here we have our cool guy, dry ice. This is CO2. It's naturally formed during the fermentation. It's heavier than air, and it has a relatively high solubility. Sulfur dioxide here is an antioxidant, it's antimicrobial. This is using SO2 as a gas. It's heavier than air. I want to throw that out there as it has been used in the past fairly frequently in the industry, but you have to be extraordinarily careful using this and with any inert gas. But SO2 is definitely corrosive and it's hazardous. And when we're talking about inert gases, you know, you have to know what you're doing, especially in confined spaces, because a lot of times these will displace oxygen and can have an asphyxiation risk. So be very careful and thoughtful and deliberate on what you're doing and when you're doing it. Nitrogen is lighter than air, low solubility, and I believe it's the best gas for nitrogen sparging. Okay, for ripping dissolved oxygen out. I don't think it's a very good gas for headspace management. I would think that the other three are better. And then you've got argon over here. This is heavier than air and has a low solubility. One of the reasons it's not used very frequently is a lot of times it's the cost and sometimes availability depending on where you're at. So inert gas usage when it comes to nitrogen sparging. Here you have on the left-hand side of the screen, that is a sparging kit that I put together with Crush to Cellar, our sister company. It's available as a kit. It's food grade hardware. It's stainless hardware where it contacts the wine. So, you know, last thing you want to do is take, you know, some brass fittings, air fittings, and drop them in your wine and thereby maybe causing a copper issue, which is an oxidative catalyst and has a legal limit. So that's why this one in particular is all stainless and food grade. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is sparging in action. So sometimes I get the question of, hey, when you sparge, are you talking about sparging the headspace or sparging the wine? I'm referring to putting this sparging stone in the liquid and turning the gas on and allowing that gas to displace, this is specifically nitrogen, nitrogen is displacing dissolved oxygen and CO2. So word of caution, if you're at the end of fermentation and your wine's very cold because you're cold crashing and it's got a lot of dissolved CO2 and you toss a nitrogen stone in and crank the nitrogen on, that's probably going to be a pretty violent release of CO2. So be careful. On the left-hand side here, you have, this is actually a very large sparging stone. Now this is in a brewery. And if you ever want to get a crash course on being very careful with oxygen pickup, go visit a good brewery because they are way more concerned with it than winemakers are or perhaps should be. So this is on the way to a bright tank. They are looking to put CO2 into solution, and they're using such a large carb stone because their flow rates are pretty high, and they're trying to get as much pre-carb as they can to shorten the amount of time that they have to carb in the bright tank. But you can do the same thing with nitrogen and sparge nitrogen in line as the wine is flowing through. And I've seen some larger facilities that are much more concerned with dissolved oxygen. These are winemaking facilities, and they actually have these carb stones on the outlet of all of their pumps, and they're sparging as they pump prophylactically. And they're doing that for a reason. So the size of the sparge stone, where you put it, that all depends on your surface area, how fast you're flowing, your desired level of gas saturation, and your budget. So another way that you can control your redox buffering capacity or your relative ability to withstand exposure to oxygen, you can do it with other things other than nitrogen sparging. Purely's longevity to absorb the oxygen that you pick up, really useful for long-term aging cycles. So you know you're going to be in barrel for a long time or in tank for a long time, or maybe you're shipping product in the bulk format, you know, across the state or across state lines. Purely's longevity can be a tool to use to absorb the inevitable pickup of dissolved oxygen. And I've spent a lot of time when I was shipping and receiving bulk wine over the years, looking at the DO pickup from the origin to the receiving facility. I wish I would have had something like this to use because there's nothing you can really do during transit. But now with something like Purely's longevity, you can. Glutastar, again, this is tapping into the antioxidant capability of glutathione, which is kind of correlated back to that concept of lees aging and the protective benefits that it have. Now this is in a refined form that you can use. Also, you have, this is one of our finishing kits. This is a few of our tannins. These tannins can be added to the wine at various stages of production in order to increase the buffering capacity to improve antioxidant characteristics of the wine. But they also have other, maybe more desirable effects on flavor and aroma and color and things like that. But they are a tool in the toolbox. All of these are.
Hey, Luke.
Yes, sir.
Just really quick, we're at 11:46.
Yep.
So maybe 5-10 more minutes, and then hopefully we can attack some of these questions. We got a lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay. I'll keep going pretty quick. I'm trying. I just have lots of words.
No, it's all great. I know it's it's a lot to cover. You know, we want to respect these, you know, components, and you know, it's just want to stress that this is the first webinar as a reference webinar. There's a lot of other topics we can get into and spend hours on. So in this case, but yeah, please, you're doing great.
Okay, cool. Here we go. So, like I mentioned in the earlier slide, there are alternatives for SO2 for microbial control that we have now that we didn't have 20 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. So some of these chitin glucan ketosan products like Bacillus and Nobretenside, fantastic to help control these populations of microorganisms and not rely on the broad spectrum activity of SO2. These are very good to utilize as a specific for a specific microbial population. You know, we also have filtration. So this is a Paul Crossflow that Scott Labs sells and distributes. This is doing a physical removal of these microbial populations in solution. So we're not requiring SO2 again to do this antimicrobial activity when you pull out the microbe populations. And then you also have Velcorin as well. Now this is usually used on the bottling line, and it is a microbial control agent that is very effective. And please contact if you'd like to know more, because there's a lot to know. So headspace management, and I think what I really want to point out here, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but this middle picture here is a cork finished bottle. When you use an insertable closure, much of the headspace in the bottle is taken up by the physical presence of a cork or an insertable closure. And the ullage, the headspace in that bottle is relatively small. What's happened as the industry has started to transition somewhat into screw caps is they've taken the same mold and just grafted on a screw cap finish. So when you do that, now you no longer have that insertable closure inside the neck of the bottle, And therefore your headspace, the quantity of headspace that you have to be concerned with in a crown cap or screw cap finish bottle is quite a bit more than you do with an insertable closure. Now that's not to talk about the oxygen that the cork may be potentially adding to the wine. That's a different story that has to do with OTR and such. But just from a headspace standpoint, I haven't got bored enough to do the analysis and the math on the actual percentage and volume and correlate that to the per gallon exposure. But that's something eventually somebody should do. I'm going to try to play this video. It may or may not work here, but this is the inline liquid nitrogen dosing for a screw cap application. And you can see the doser there. There's a liquid nitrogen doer behind there. And here's the bottles going down the line. It's a very short video. And one more time. So as that liquid nitrogen comes in contact with the wine, it forms gas, and what it does is it starts pushing out the headspace oxygen, and really is a powerful tool in controlling your headspace and total package oxygen. Okay, one of the things that I like to point out is this information has been covered in detail for many, many years. This is from Dr. Bruce Auckland, from one of his enology notes, and we don't have to go and read this whole thing, but the concentration molecular oxygen should be less than 0.5 parts per million in your wine prior to bottling. And any increase above 0.2 parts per million indicates excessive pickup. I would caution that I think a lot of producers are much, much higher in initial DO and probably much, much higher in pickup on the bottling line. And so thank you, Bruce. There's a great picture of Dr. Auckland. Continuing on in the same vein, from the same source, this is why people have vacuum fillers, vacuum corkers, and they're doing bottle gas flushing in order to reduce the pickup on the bottling line. Because if you want to really experience bottle shock in your daily life, switch from a vacuum corker to a hand corker, where you're literally pressurizing the bottle with atmospheric air. And generally speaking, 4 milligrams of sulfur dioxide are needed to neutralize the effects of 1 part per million of dissolved oxygen. That's a very important key takeaway. We're not going to talk about the very specific chemistry and action of this. This is just a takeaway thought process. So what you can do is, if you want to know how much oxygen you picked up on the bottling line, go measure a bottle of wine after a couple of months, because you should know how much SO2 that you added and shot for and achieved in your bottling tank, and you can measure your SO2 depletion, and that is correlated to your dissolved oxygen pickup, which is basically your total package oxygen. Okay, I'm seeing some of these poll results. Interesting. Okay, so sacred cows, and one of them that I'm going to address is splash racking. And I want to be very careful with, this is the kind of that terminology and how we're using these words. When I'm referring to a splash racking after fermentation for volatile sulfur compound remediation, I'm not talking about délestage, rack and return, venturis, racking carts during fermentation on skin contact. I'm talking splash racking after fermentation. It is my assertion, and a lot of people are with me on this, that splash racking is really a not effective way to functionally eliminate volatile sulfur compounds. It's a way to, for a time, reduce the perception of those. And then again, confusing reduction with sensory expression. Reduction is an electrochemical measurement of a wine's redox potential. And when you do have these negative sensory compounds, we commonly say, oh, this wine is reduced. Well, yes, from a measurement standpoint, it is, but the expression of those volatile sulfur compounds has more to do with the formation of them during fermentation, and not dealing with them in the cellar. If you never get your wines electrochemically reduced in the cellar, you probably will never smell those volatile sulfur compounds. Then you put them in the bottle, and that wine gets reduced because there's not as much air exposure, and then those compounds show up. And this is why we decant red wines commonly. And you can swirl a glass and kind of get rid of those compounds. Again, I kind of spoke to this earlier, but pumping harms a wine, or filtration harms a wine. You know, I think that there can be some negative effects that comes from those things, but it's from improper oxygen management downstream of this after you've done this action and not addressing the dissolved oxygen pickup that is actually the cause. And the pumping and filtration is simply involved in the process. The cause is dissolved oxygen pickup. And with what we're talking about with these tannins and these specific inactivity yeast products and nitrogen sparging, you can control and mitigate that pickup. Screw caps cause reduction. I hear that all the time. Or in the same vein, we'll probably start hearing this a lot, that wine goes reductive in the cans. Now, the function between cans and screw caps are a little differently because there's some other interactions with the liner and aluminum that may be coming into play. But generally speaking, when saying screw caps cause reduction, I think is inappropriate in that the wine had those volatile sulfur compounds in there anyways, and they formed in the bottle because the screw cap is such an effective seal. However, you can take that same wine and switch from screw caps right into some insertable closure like a cork, and depending on the type of cork and which one it is, whether it's a dense cork or a loose cork or a micro, you can still get reduction with the cork. It's just, I think that screw caps are a better seal, and so you sometimes see it more quicker that way. Emphasis on OTR, again, I think a lot of times we're seeing the forest for the trees. Oxygen transmission rate expressed as milliliters per liter per month. It really talks with a very small amount of oxygen. And if you're not dealing with the potential 9 parts per million of dissolved oxygen you have in your wine in the bottling tank, the OTR is just going to exacerbate a huge problem that was already there. And barrels are their best. You know, the best wine is made in barrels. And while that may be potentially true, this topping schedule and the oxidation that happens, and then the prevalence of spoilage in the industry that we see during barrel aging, that's why I'm throwing out this term barrel shock. And maybe we should take a little bit better approach to our oxygen management when going into barrels. And then my favorite one, SO2 causes headaches. For some reason, you know, what they say is a lie will travel halfway around the world before truth puts its pants on. SO2 causes headaches. People think that they're allergic to SO2. I do believe that actually what people are allergic to are biogenic amines, specifically histamine and tyramine. These are produced by bacteria and sometimes Brettanomyces in a low SO2 environment. So this movement from getting away from SO2 and using natural indigenous microflora in an attempt to have a quote unquote healthier wine could be potentially causing more headaches than not. And so only a Sith deals in absolutes right there on my cow. And I think that's one of the things, you know, if you've ever called and talked to somebody at Scott Labs and you ask them a question, a lot of times they say, well, it depends. And it's not because we're trying to make things confusing. It's because absolutes, that these screw caps cause reduction or pumping harms a wine, is really a not very deliberate way to approach the problem. So here are the quick take homes. And we can, we've already covered these, and we probably, for the sake of brevity and time, we can move on. If you want to come back to these, we can at a later time.
Well, yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, Luke. The schedule for the webinar is 11 to 12. So I hope you can hang on a little bit longer. This will probably be what will happen. We'll do the presentation, and then there'll be some question period, obviously, at the end. But I understand you have to leave. The webinar will be available. Eventually, at some point, we will post them all online on our website, so it's a lot easier to find. But in the meantime, if you need a copy, email me at darrenm@scottlab.com, DARRENM@scottlab.com. Thank you so much, Luke. Of course, he's available, and we're also available to chat on the phone and stuff. So here's a little bit of homework before you guys take off. There's a Wall-E-Mon webinar coming up called The Shifting Wine Landscape, Reshape to Survive and Succeed. That economic pressure is imminent as a result of the pandemic. It is difficult to know what to expect over the following months and years. And so on June 17th, I only mentioned June 17th because it's the one that, there's two sessions, one on the 16th and 17th, but there's one at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on June 17th, and they're going to go over a lot of stuff, which will be very interesting. I don't want to throw that out there too. But very, very good. We got a lot of questions to cover. So again, I apologize for if you need to go and you'd love to hang in there. The webinar will be available, and go ahead and you just go ahead and skip to the end if you want. Although I recommend with this topic, you just readdress it and address it and address it. I've been in the industry for a while, but that's nothing compared to other people in the industry. Our combined, experience, 35, 40 years. And oxygen is still by far it being such an important factor in not only, making wines better, but also making wines a lot worse. So really stress that oxygen prevention, oxidation prevention is much easier. And sometimes it's impossible to do remediation. So prevention versus remediation. And I think that's a really good big take home that Luke has highlighted today. Oxygen's a tough one. There's a lot of places to go for it. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and mention, hopefully you guys figured out all the polls. I can share some polling results, but I'm going to go ahead and reach out to one of the attendees. They have a question, they have their hands up, and go ahead, Israel, if you have a question. You are muted. I will ask to unmute. We are muted.
Darren, do you want to hit the Q&As?
Yeah, we do, but we do have a lot of those too. But if your hand is raised and you're willing to talk out loud, I usually start with those first, to be honest with you. Allowed to talk. Anybody else? Okay. Then we will do the Q&As. First up, we had some questions chatted, making sure there's at least acknowledgement that oxygen is very complex. So here's a good Q&A. First off, what is the best way to roll a tank to get the DO down? Gas used, equipment used, then how do you test the tank to get accurate DO numbers? Seems the surface is always higher and dissolved oxygen to the bottom of the tank.
So that may have been a question that was asked before we went through the slides, because I do believe that was answered in the slides, but yeah. Use nitrogen gas, use a sparging stone. Gas flow meter is the best way as opposed to a gas regulator. And you put the stone down into the wine, turn the gas on, and sparge the dissolved oxygen out. And yes, surface is going to be higher in DO than the bottom, of course, because it's closer to the headspace. And then using a good DO meter to measure the effectiveness of your scrubbing is the way to go. You can use kind of like a 3 to 5 volume change of high purity nitrogen, assuming the wine's at saturation. You'll use so much nitrogen that way, you should probably just get a DO meter. It'll pay for itself. Right on. And then the next question we have, which is buffer capacity. And I do want to point out, generally when you talk about buffering capacity, it's about acid solutes and the ability of a system, a liquid system, to buffer against pH changes. But that being said, there is absolutely an accepted concept of redox buffer capacity. So did you want to comment on that? That there's a difference between buffer capacity as a classic concept and then redox. And again, this is a whole topic we could spend hours on. Yeah. So this webinar is really just to kind of go through some terminology. So as we move forward in these talks, we could at least start agreeing on what we're talking about. So when you're talking about buffer capacity, you're talking morely about redox, right? Yes, and okay. The wine's ability to buffer any exposure to oxygen that it has. You're still going to have a pH buffer capacity that's variety, wine, time, all the things dependent, as a completely separate topic that we're not concerned with here. Okay. And then I wanted to point out too with the question that SO2 is molecular.
When you talk about molecular forms, which is the pH-dependent form of SO2 in your wine beverage, typically it's the molecular form that is antimicrobial. It's something, a guideline. Would you agree with that? I mean, the SO2 molecular value or form is really about antimicrobial, but it is helpful to a certain extent when you talk about oxygen, just not directly, right?
Tune in to Nicola's presentation that she gave a couple weeks ago for more info.
Okay, that's
the best way to answer it, because she answers it so much better than I ever can. So
yeah, totally. Here's a great question. Is there a chart on total oxygen uptake capacity for varietals to use as a guide?
No, there's really not. And, you know, some people have different thought processes on how much oxygen that they want to expose the wine to. Some people like hyperox, some people like microox, you know, more on Tannat, less on Pinot Noir. There's so many different philosophies on that. And, you know, hyperox or microox, all these additions of oxygen, if you don't have a DO meter and you're not watching your dissolved oxygen and you're not measuring your VA and free SO2, I don't think you're looking at the whole picture there. So no, that's definitely a experience-based thing that you learn with your varieties, with your vineyards, depending on your pH, your other use of antimicrobial agents, how you're packaging. It's a very complex discussion.
It's a great question. You know, in a perfect world, I mean, wine, that's one thing about wine. It's so interesting to make, you know, and it's not like, I had this discussion with a meeting this morning about clients about fermentation. You know, if you were just trying to take sugar and to convert it to alcohol, it'd be a lot easier, and it's a whole different conversion. With wine, though, it is so different. The matrices are so different. But you did touch on, for the most part, the fact that if you've got a fairly tannic wine, at least, although there is some evidence to support that redox potential measuring in of itself might be related to varietal, but not necessarily could be put in a chart and dictated. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, so I think the industry in 15 years or 20 years, everyone's going to be talking redox potential and millivolts, and it's just going to be as elemental as anything else that we currently use. I don't think industry-wide there's the acceptance on redox potential yet. I believe it is a very fascinating area. I'm zooming out from these very specific, tiny, measurable things and saying, look, Tannat's going to have a bigger buffering capacity to oxygen than Pinot Grigio is. I think most people would accept that. Controlling your dissolved oxygen is a good thing. You need to know what it is. It affects everything else. So that's kind of where I'm at on that whole topic.
Is there a magical number for DO? Like, say, I mean, obviously it's different for different stages, but like, yeah. And what would you prefer to see if you had a perfect world?
So taking into account the amount of spoilage and oxidation problems we have in the industry, I'm going to err on the side of caution, which is below 0.5 part per million. People can argue
for
with
reds
me on
and
that.
Whites.
For just across the board, once you start measuring things and looking at the dissolved oxygen, you can learn and build off of that with your own experience. But if someone's going to ask me broad spectrum, it's less than 0.5.
Okay, and then here's a shot. Here's a situational question. I make Chardonnay by crushing, destemming, immediately followed by pressing. After pressing, the juice turns gray. After settling overnight with a preemptive bentonite treatment, the juice is beautifully clear. I've been told that this process is called black Chardonnay. What is happening? Is this detrimental, and does this make any wine more resistant to oxidation level? Again, you guys, this is a fantastic conversation. This one topic could probably go for an hour, but do you have a quick comment on this?
Yeah, so basically that's something related to that hyperox discussion, where you're getting this brown or gray juice. And what you're doing is you're oxidizing compounds that are susceptible to oxidation. And this is the argument between brown and green juice. If you brown it and oxidize it before fermentation, you're dropping those phenolics out and oxidizing them. If you don't, and you handle things so reductively on the front end, this is where you get things like pinking downstream. So
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I was just
Oh,
going to say
that's it.
really quick. Reductive winemaking is such a standard operating procedure for so much Sauvignon Blanc comes out of like the Southern Hemisphere that I should stress that that it also is too. It's a very, when you do reductive winemaking, because of the lack of oxygen, for instance, you really do need to start worrying about your ergosterol or exoergosterol and your rehydration nutrients, because you don't have the level of oxygen, but you're maintaining a lot of those thiols and esters from oxidation. But I think that's a really good point. Which inert gas do you recommend to manage Headspace? And we've got some questions, so this might be the introduction to a lightning round. Which inert gas do you recommend to manage Headspace?
Argon.
Argon, perfect. Good, excellent. Can you address oversparging with nitrogen pre-bottling, specifically blowing off favorable aromatics? And that's actually, honestly, a communication for somebody who was chatting with the panelists about it. Do you worry about it? I mean, I know some clients are worried about it. Is it a concern? What's your feeling on that?
Okay, I've made somewhere in the neighborhood about 30 million gallons of wine, and I sparged most of that pretty liberally. And I've since had a lot of clients and customers start sparging on a regular basis before bottling at all points in between. Never once have I or anybody else I've ever met say that they lost favorable aromatics. But you know what I hear all the time, Darren? I've got VA. Oh, I've got mousiness. Oh, I've got a microbial problem. Oh, my SO2 isn't effective. I hear that a lot more than I do. I lost 3 nanograms per liter of linalool.
Yeah, totally. That's been, I mean, honestly, it's been my, of course, it's anecdotal, but I do remember having some trials done that in a couple of places I've worked where we were curious about it, and it wasn't even close. The fact that if the kind of concern we had of sparging and quote blowing off aromatics versus the oxidation process was not even close. I mean, we had much more aroma, much more. If that was the kind of wine we were trying to do, if it was already hyper oxidized wine, to a certain extent, it didn't really much matter. But when it came to like a preserved white wine or even a light red, where you really, really do want to maintain those aromas, that fruitiness, and you want to bottle that magic that you've made, it's best to sparge if possible. For the least product for managing redox buffering capacity, would there be any issues for exporting the finished product if it had been used? In other words, is it on the 250 list?
That's your department.
Shock question. It's a
follow up
TDP
on
question.
Yeah.
How's this liability? It is, nanoprotein usage or yeast products used post declaration of wine is on the list. It's totally legal, but it's a question to ask. Now, that being said, when I've worked with a lot of clients who do use products on the 250 list, what I recommend, we generally at Scott Lab say, if it's on the 250 list, it's not exportable. And that's a very, very safe way to go about it, because we don't really want to make things worse for anybody that's used product. But that being said, though, my experience, and I emphasize to say that, is that when I've dealt with folks exporting wine to markets, I had them go back to their importer and ask them, is this product okay to use? And in fact, a product of pure lees is absolutely required by some exporters of bulk wine. And so in that case, the concern about 250 status is much, much less. Now, 246 for real quick is that pretty much anything you do to that wine that's in 246 is 100%. It's totally good. You can export it no matter what. It's required by importers to take that treatment. 250 is domestic use, continual use, but you have to really check to see if you're an exporter. And then 249 is experimental. It's not authorized at all, and you can't even sell that wine domestically if it's treated with that product. Right. Anyways, that's really fast, and that's a whole nother discussion. Go ahead and email me at darrenm@scottlab.com, darrenm@scottlab.com. We can explore that a little more if you need any help with that. But honestly, it's a very, very good question. It's just something that requires a little more of an answer than we can answer here. Yeah. Which is long-term, natural cork versus synthetic? Go.
For sake of brevity, natural cork, no question.
Natural cork, yeah, that's a pretty easy one. You're worried about cork taint, obviously, but natural cork is by far a lot longer And after working in a company that used a lot of synthetic corks, there's definitely a shelf life limit.
Yep.
And any reputable synthetic cork seller will tell you that. They'll tell you how many years it's available to be stored. Can you be more specific about splashwhacking after fermentation? Oh, I'm sorry again. Thank you guys for showing up. If you have to leave, I understand. Go ahead and click on in the Zoom webinar again later if you'd like. I really, really appreciate the time. Next question. Can you be more specific about splashwhacking after fermentation? Do you mean after primary when barreling down?
Yes, yeah,
right?
yes, but also it's like if the wine goes reductive in the cellar at some point in the tank or the barrel, you know, a lot of people recommend splash racking it with oxygen to try to blow those volatile sulfur compounds away into the atmosphere and they fly off. That's what I'm saying specifically. I do not recommend. That is 1970s recommendations that I think we should move beyond. And it's kind of correlated with what this next question that John has, which is, have you had much success exposing white wine to oxygen to reduce reduction after fermentation and later in aging? So if you're talking about manipulating redox potential and making something more oxidative, absolutely. If you're talking about reducing the reduction, reducing the smell, again,
now it's a paradox.
again, that is now, you are delaying the expression of those or changing the perceptibility of those sulfur compounds. They will come back.
Okay. It was a great question though, by the way. It's a fantastic question because I really do like that question. Is there technology on bottling trucks to sparge the filler bowl? Okay. Or would you just suggest doing inline sparging to be done in the cellar?
So yes, there is technology on bottling trucks. Every brand of filler is going to have a different technology that they use. I used a Crohn's filler at one point that it would pull a vacuum, fill the bottle with nitrogen, pull a vacuum again, fill it with nitrogen again, and then fill the wine. So, you know, whether it's a MBF or a Guy or Prospero, whatever, they're all going to have different technologies and they're going to have different DO pickups. So short answer, yes. Would you suggest doing inline sparging to be done in the cellar? Again, very generally, if you're asking me that question, yes. And Clark he's got a chart on O2 appetite for variety, thousands of wines for 6 years. Yeah, Clark has been on this topic for a long time, so feel free to go there as well.
Yeah. I can't copy and paste it, but there is a link that he shared on the question and answer. Thanks for showing up, Clark. Thanks for the comments. I really appreciate it.
I'm a little careful to recommend a certain amount of oxygen per variety because I don't know what area it's grown in. I don't know what pH it is. I don't know the potassium contents. I don't know the metal contents. I don't know what's going on in the cellar. So I'm a little hesitant to recommend such things.
Honestly, I'm going to type this in for the chat just to share it, just in case. And like I said, we're not worried about, there's a lot of different schools out there. There's some things like I don't like, which is absolutely don't add a bunch of oxygen to your wine right before bottling. I think we can all agree on that. But there's a couple other things. We're not endorsing necessarily the link, but officially, but he says he's done a lot of analysis on it, and it's information. Let's just share the information. No, information's not going to kill us. We still kill our own cells. So redox and pH.
Huge topic.
Did you see that question? Yeah. I don't know if we can do that here.
We can't.
It really does involve. We could spend a whole semester on that, which Clark probably has.
Yep.
Does using nitrogen to manage headspace also take out dissolved oxygen, or does only a sparging stone remove dissolved oxygen?
Okay, so again, this is an absolute binary question, and I'm going to say...
Well, the answer is no. Right, for the most part?
For the most part, yes. So nitrogen sparging to remove dissolved oxygen using a stone down at the bottom of the tank is the way to go. If you're looking to manage headspace, that's where I think argon or CO2 comes into play. Be careful with CO2 because it is soluble. If you have temperature changes and active CO2 in the headspace, it can come back into solution if the wine gets colder, potentially causing a vacuum situation in a tank. So that's why
Go ahead, sorry.
I generally recommend argon because of that reason.
Yeah, and I do want to stress that, Luke threw up on there just straight up Zoklin. Thank you, Bruce, for your information. And then he's got a couple slides or a couple pages in his old textbook that shows the difference of sparging, empty space versus sparging wine, and it's significantly different. So I would definitely recommend to view those as totally separate processes. Does the pad filtration and bottling have a measurable uptake of DO?
Yes, absolutely. Every cellar action has a measurable oxygen uptake, depending on who's doing it and how careful they are and what they're doing and how big the batch is. That will depend. That will affect how much O2 is picked up.
When you sparge liberally with nitrogen, how long are you talking about sparging? I mean, we have a general rule of thumb, but I mean, depending, it's so complex, but go ahead and take a stab at it if you have an answer to this.
I would say 30 minutes, 45 minutes is about right. If you have a really big tank with really high DO and it's very low temperature, it might take a lot longer than that. When I've made wine on that micro scale, every time I was filtering, pumping, moving, blending, the stone was in the wine, bubbling. Just let it go.
Yeah. Again, I can't stress this enough. This is a conversation. We're not, officially endorsing everything, but I will say that answer does require a little bit of work on what your temperature is, what your temperature is. I mean, that's right there. It's a big example. I've seen nightmare situations where people sparged literally all night because their wine was stored at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So the solubility is so temperature dependent. I mean, we're going back to physics with that stuff.
Sure.
How often would you recommend topping barrels in a cellar that is approximately 65% humidity and 65 degrees Fahrenheit year round? I mean, that's another difficult question to answer, but
okay. But I'll answer it like this. If it's Pinot Grigio, I probably would touch it maybe once a year, or Pinot Noir, something very delicate. Like I would open it and mess with it as few times as possible. Again, Tannat, Petit Syrah, Cabernet, it's going to have a bigger buffering capacity. What I'm referring to is pulling that bung off and exposing a lot of oxygen into the barrel. I think that action of topping introduces more oxygen than we think we're doing. We think we're preventing oxygen, but I think we're actually adding it. So
yeah, it's a very good point, and it makes me think of some experiments we did back in the day, looking at because I had a client that wanted us to top every 2 weeks, and I'm like, oh my goodness, you got to be kidding me. Well, that's what they wanted to do, and lo and behold, after enough time looking at free sulfurs, looking at VAs didn't change significantly, but the free sulfurs we saw, and yeah, absolutely, there was a law of diminishing return. There was much more diminishing return. I've used a rule of thumb when we had some contracts written up and then included regular maintenance of barrels, that we'd at least do it if they wanted to once a month. Again. There's also a great research out there that showed somebody hammering topping the barrel, filling it up, hammering the bung in, and then turning the barrel 15 degrees.
Yeah.
And man, that was like putting it almost in static environment, except for the barrel offering so much oxygen by its nooks and crannies. It wasn't exactly antioxidative. But I'd be comfortable in saying, and this is again my opinion about it, experience working with a lot of clients, is that I'd like to see at least quarterly a test of what your free sulfur VA is. But again, I stress that very, very well. All these like treatments and topics and intervals should be driven by analysis. What's your free sulfur? What's your VA? What's your dissolved oxygen? All those things will be answered by your by that analysis. Let's say I have 6,000 gallons. I'm debating about whether to store in a tank or a barrel. What do you recommend?
When you say store, I'm assuming it's fairly long term.
Long term.
I would say in the tank, because when you break that tank down into barrels, you're introducing O2, and just for long-term storage, a larger batch in a topped up tank is going to be better than breaking it down into smaller batches. Yeah,
and I want to say this question is actually a very, very, very good question. It's a very complicated answer because then we start getting into, well, what do you want? What's your target? And I myself, the oxygen exposure is so significantly different. If your goal is to not have any oxygen introduced in your volume of liquid, whatever it is in wine, then yes, obviously the best way to do it is a larger volume with no headspace, right? That would be, if that's your goal. But a lot of times with red wines, they really, really need slow introduction of oxygen over time, usually through the nooks and crannies of a barrel. And you put up with that evaporation, and then you put up with that being in a barrel. So this question is really, really involved with a lot of other factors in there. But honestly, yes, if your goal is to keep that wine perfectly absent of oxygen, the best way to do it is to put it in an inert container surface, which is like, glass, or not glass, obviously, but stainless steel, and to eliminate all headspace and make sure there's no headspace ever.
There's also
the question I got to, and actually, let me say real quick, there was a sub comment in the chats, and it says the goal is to long-term storage.
Then yes, it would be in the 6,000 gallon tank. Also remember that, when you take a 6,000 gallon tank and put into 160 gallon barrels, now you have 60 lots to keep track of. The labor standpoint alone might be worth just keeping it in the big tank.
What about sparging versus rolling the tank? I mean, I have an opinion about that.
Go ahead.
Why not just roll the tank versus sparging it?
So I think you can do either one. If you're talking about sparging in line versus just rolling the tank, sparging in line, you have the interaction. There's a higher surface area to stone interaction, so it can be a little bit more effective per unit time and gas usage, as opposed to just dropping a stone into a tank. So.
Yeah, I mean, I say after doing so many times dealing with trying to target a DO. I mean, the target DOs of the large facility, a couple of the large facilities I worked at, I mean, they were targeting 0.5 or 0.8 parts per million oxygen. Absolutely. That's after in the bottle. That means pulling a bottle and measuring the oxygen right after bottling. It had to be less than 0.8. And to achieve those pre-bottling figures, it's sparging. I mean, sparging. Rolling is just maybe more of a macro oxygen effect. If you could introduce the gas through a sparging, that would be best. Can you share about methods to reduce reduction instead of splash racking?
This is where things like Regulus and perhaps copper can be used to remove the volatile sulfur compounds as opposed to splash wrecking. What I would say about copper in of itself, it is an oxidative catalyst. It does have a legal limit. If you do use it, you want to make sure you don't have residual levels. Whereas Regulus, I would say, is a much more gentle approach to dealing with reduction.
You have a general rule of thumb for temperature for storing white wines in tank to reduce dissolved oxygen?
If they're dry, I would say below 55.
Yeah, and also, guys, keep in mind, go back to that chart about solubility. If the white wine has been exposed to a lot of oxygen, you have headspace, and you crash chill it down, you're going to be begging for oxidation because the solubility of oxygen is so much higher. We use what kind of regulator do you say you recommend for sparging? I'm assuming this is a gas regulator, right?
This is a flow meter. If you look at the slide that had that sparging stone, the hose, and it's a flow meter, not necessarily a pressure regulator.
Okay. Is the recommended level of DO the same for all stages across the winemaking process? Are there moments when they wish you have more DO? If so, do we have parameters for different stages?
That's a great question. It's very complicated. Yes, there are different dissolved oxygen levels that may be appropriate depending on your wine at different stages. That's a very complicated question that is best learned over time, and I wouldn't have a general rule of thumb.
I mean, generally, if you're going to introduce oxygen and you think it's important, it's going to happen during the fermentation.
Yes.
And absolutely, it's absolutely required for yeast nutrition. So during fermentation, you want oxygen, you want the oxygen exposure. It helps with sterol production, cellular cell wall synthesis. So, it's something that we might follow up later in subsequent webinars, but absolutely you want oxygen, unless you're making super reductive winemaking during the fermentation. But much after that, though, unless you want, no. I say this to clients so many times because they taste their wine and they talk about terroir. Oh, can you taste the fruit? and you see the bear. I'm like, you know, you want to talk about terroir, but it's like oxygen is not terroir. Oxygen covers the surface of the earth at basically the same concentration. So when I taste an oxidized wine and then talking about terroir, I'm like, well, you might have had terroir, but you've totally eliminated the concept of terroir by overexposing your wine to that non-terroir component, which is oxygen. Centrifugal pump transfer versus Waukesha. What's your feeling? Any difference between them for DO pickup?
I think that's a very loaded question. I like it though.
Yeah.
It has more to do with the seal design than it does with anything. There's two types of Waukeshas out there that are used commonly in the industry, and a centrifugal can be a Waukesha, by the way, because they make centrifugal pumps. There's a U1 design, which is probably the most common, that has a higher degree of dissolved oxygen pickup than maybe a U2 Waukesha. And then a centrifugal pump, again, depends on how you run it. I would very generally say that a Waukesha is going to have a lower pickup than a centrifugal pump.
Great. If you're sparging with nitrogen line, where's the best location to put the sparging stone?
On the outlet line of from a pump, right? You don't want to cavitate a pump, so don't put it on the inlet side of the pump. And you're going to pick up the oxygen at the pump head, so you want to do it on the downstream, the outlet side.
Is there a difference between molecular oxygen and dissolved oxygen?
For the purposes of this presentation, no.
I mean, yeah. I mean, we're talking about dissolved oxygen for the most part, but yeah, oxygen, you know, as a compound, oxygen is general oxygen. Boom, it is. What we generally talk about with DO is dissolved oxygen, and the component that you care about in your beverage, because the dissolved oxygen is what's going to determine your length of your longevity of shelf life. So in
We're
that
concerned
respect,
with DO2, dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, dissolved oxygen, which is measurable. So that's a real important part about that. We're not just throwing out stuff that's not measurable. Dissolved oxygen meter measured dissolved oxygen, and your oxygen pickup and your bottling line and your bottling specs are related to dissolved oxygen. Gotcha. Is there any danger in sparging too close to bottling with nitrogen, specifically in regards to mouthfeel? Have you seen anything? I mean, I think we answered this before, but anything about mouthfeel?
So nitrogen can displace CO2. So if you are looking for a little bit of that CO2 to add like a little bit of crispness to the wine, and you are sparging really close to that, you can remove that CO2 and affect the mouthfeel that you wanted, yes. However, I have bottled wine while I'm sparging.
Okay.
So, and I haven't seen some really negative effect of the nitrogen sparging. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead. Well, thank you so much again. This has been awesome. Of course, these conversations will always continue. The webinars are meant to spark conversations. So hopefully moving forward, you'll have some idea. Hopefully you can go back to this webinar again and again for referential points. I'm going to share some for the rest of us that are still here. I want to share some polling results. Here's the polling results for common oxygen-related wine. Common oxygen-related faults in wine production. So by far, we saw a loss of fruit across the board. So that's not surprising. And some oxidized aroma. It's a little bit of mouse in there. Kind of spread apart. It
seems like this is an applicable topic then.
Yeah. Measuring oxygen. By far, well, it's a split between I have a dissolved oxygen meter and I don't measure oxygen at all.
Yeah, and then people that are backing into it with free SO2.
Yeah, I mean, I would say thankfully about what I see is about 76% have some idea what their oxygen pickup is, even though it'd probably be best to get a meter to measure directly. But indirect measurement of oxygen introduction with sulfur is not a bad, at least it's something. But I definitely recommend getting a dissolved oxygen meter. But at least if you know, because I do have a horror story about a client having all their whites get destroyed by not knowing their oxygen levels. And once they actually just bought the meter, it was like, oh, I have 9 parts per million, which is basically saturated O2 when I bottle. That might be a reason why after 4 months, all my wines are undrinkable. I'm like, yeah, just knowing will kit you. It will free you. Knowledge will free you. And then finally, how often, if you ever do utilize splash racking, never or occasionally. Between those two, you either never use it or occasionally use it post fermentation. So, you know, we still have some folks using it after fermentation. It's not the best. I do say, like, Regulus or other ways dealing with it, but more importantly, look at how you're fermenting. You know, these VSCs are occurring. Most likely it's probably to do with some insufficiency. You got to look at your nutrients. You got to look at your yeast selections. You got to look at everything. And go from there. So that's that. I also, on a side note, Luke, and it's of course one of these things where, you know, it's we've got some more. Can you sparge with CO2 or nitrogen only? We recommend nitrogen in general. Just watch out for CO2 because it is fairly soluble in wines. Can high DO affect total sulfur? No, not really.
Well, indirectly.
Unless it respires. Well, yeah, but no. Oh, right. But if, say you have a total. Oh, right. What am I talking about? But yes, if you have total sulfur though, and the value is 50, and you pump it full with a bunch of oxygen, will that total sulfur change? Not really. Not really.
The way it's correlated is if you have high DO and you keep throwing SO2 at it, and
yes, you'll get
mitigating, you're going to have really high total SO2s.
Yeah, well, the total SO2 is your free and bound, right? So you know, you'll definitely have an effect on your free. There is some evidence that I've seen in alternative packaging. Like bag in the box, where the total is cardboard box and bag, and I have seen total sulfurs diminish over time in some wine products, but it's not a significant effect. Do you guys have any recommendations for cost-effective DO meters? Unfortunately, we have a meter with a plus or minus of 0.6 parts per million. Yeah, that is not quite accurate enough for the wine industry. Well, at least you're not in the beer industry where it's like 1 or 2 parts per billion, right?
Yeah, you spend $12,000 on a DO meter if you're in the beer industry.
Yeah. So, I mean, like Orion, there's a couple out there that are pretty good. I mean, that's a personal thing. I like Orion. Those are good.
Yeah, I do
YSI
too.
is really good.
Yep.
YSI.
And Hack.
I've had, huh?
HACH, Hawk. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks again.
Okay. All right, thank you.
That was freaking awesome. That was fantastic. I want to give a shout out to John Overstreet. I'm sorry about using your full name, but I want to say thank you because you sent me an email that showed a screenshot of how wrong I was about the initial description of the screen. So thank you for that. It was very helpful me writing the intro for this one. Don't forget the Lullamon webinar. It's coming up on June 17th. It's going to be very interesting, how to sell wine during a pandemic. It's going to be very good. Because I don't think these pandemic situations are going to disappear anytime soon. I think that's it. Thank you guys for your time. I can't stress that enough. If you get a chance, please submit the survey. Don't hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions or comments, my email is darrenm@scottlab.com. That's online as well. Thank you guys all so much. And all of us at Scott Labs want to wish you and your families health and happiness. Take care, guys. And thank you. It was real fun. And hopefully we'll do one again real soon. I really appreciate it.